All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Liz Schaller. I'm the NIMAC director, joined today to present by Nicole Gaines, our NIMAC project director. And we are going to cover quite a bit of information about NIMAS file creation and best practices for your XML tagging, including the resources that you should be consulting as you're producing NIMAS files. As a reminder, we do have a couple more webinars scheduled this summer that we hope you'll be able to join us for. Our next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, August 11th, so a couple weeks from now, and that is going to be a deep dive on metadata. Today, we're not going to spend much time talking about metadata. Instead, we're going to be focused on the XML file. So that session, the third webinar is going to be focused on metadata best practices. And then our fourth webinar is geared toward the customer service folks at your publishing company or organization. And it is all about how to assist your customers looking for accessible formats. So we're going to talk about the resources that you can point them to, help you have a better understanding of what the NIMAC does and doesn't do, and highlight a little one pager for you to hold on to and distribute to your colleagues so that they have that same information. And that is going to be Wednesday, August 12th at 2 p.m. So please, if you are from a publisher, please do send that information out to the folks at your organization who work directly with customers, because that is who we're focused on for that webinar. Today's session, we've got a lot of information here. We're going to start with some findings from a recent NIMAC case study to just kind of ground the conversation and help you better understand the importance of the work you do in producing NIMAS files. And then we're going to transition and talk all about creating NIMAS, including the resources that you should be consulting for NIMAS creation, and then best practices for XML tagging, as well as best practices for optional NIMAS content like alt text and MathML. And then we'll wrap up with some final hints and additional resources. But it will be pretty quick. But again, we are recording this and we will post our recording as well as the slide deck on our website. Our learning objectives for today, the first is to understand those key resources to consult in the production of well-formed NIMAS files. The second is to understand how to supply that optional alt text and MathML in NIMAS if you're asked to do so. And then the third is to reinforce NIMAS XML tagging best practices. We will pause throughout, give you plenty of time to ask questions. If you think of your question after the fact, don't hesitate to reach out to us. So first, let's talk a little bit about the NIMAC and NIMAS files and how we serve students. In 2025, the NIMAC worked with True North Evaluation, our external evaluator, on a case study on timely delivery of accessible formats. This case study included both national surveys and focus groups, as well as some more in-depth data collection from 3 states, Ohio, Oregon, and Utah. And the purpose of the case study was for us to better understand the benefits of timely delivery of accessible formats to students when files are already available in the NIMAC, as well as practices that help to facilitate timely delivery. And again, we got information from across the country, as well as some more focused, targeted information from those 3 states. If you're interested in taking a look at the report, you're welcome to do so. The full report is available on the NIMAC website, and those links are in the chat. There is a section with some recommendations at the end, so we're starting to use those recommendations as well as other input from the case study to inform our technical assistance efforts that we're building out for our next grant period. We'll be starting our next grant October 1st, and so we're starting to incorporate some of those recommendations into our work. If you do take a look at the case study and you have any thoughts or ideas in response to any of the case study findings, please don't hesitate to reach out. We would love to hear from you. And I do have just a few slides here to share some of the findings from the case study for those who might be interested. So again, one of the one of the large overarching questions of our case study was to better understand the benefits of timely delivery of accessible formats. And NIMAS is used to produce Braille, large print, accessible digital formats. And so we are a little far removed from the end user of the accessible format. So we really wanted to go out and ask questions and get input from folks at the state level, at the local level, teachers, to better understand the benefits of timely delivery of that accessible format. So some of the most popular responses to that question were that timely delivery promotes equitable access to instructional materials, that it promotes independence and active learning among students with print disabilities, that it supports the psychological well-being of students with print disabilities, as well as facilitating academic achievement and ownership of learning. And also, it can help to reduce stigma and even support positive relationships among students with print disabilities and their peers. Some other responses we got in that kind of other column include obviously that it's a fulfillment of a legal requirement that is essential. And also, interestingly, that timely delivery really helps to support teacher effectiveness in the classroom because it means that, they're not having to come up with an alternative curriculum or alternative materials for a student, that all students can engage in the same learning at the same time. So that was really helpful to get that information from our states. And then next, we wanted to know more about kind of the NIMAC related practices that help to facilitate the timely delivery of accessible formats. So the first and foremost, publishers submitting NIMAS files to the NIMAC system before they're needed by students. That was far and away our most popular response. The way our system is supposed to work is that when you submit files to the NIMAC as part of an adoption contract or agreement with a state or a district, that you do so in a way that gives enough lead time for the production of an accessible format. And for Braille in particular, it can take several months, sometimes even longer than that, to produce a full Braille textbook. So it's really essential that we have those NIMAS files in the system in advance of that need being identified for an accessible format so that that production can get started right away. We also heard from folks saying that NIMAC staffs, there are technical assistants, and especially the timeliness of it was really essential. We do assist our users sometimes when they need to reach out to publishers or have clarifying questions from publishers, or in the case of our users who work at an instructional resource center or help to fulfill accessible format requests for an entire state. Sometimes the teacher that reaches out to them doesn't understand the system yet, and so we help to support them with that as well. And then publishers holding vendors to a timeline for NIMAS conversion, that was really important as well. And other folks also mentioned the trainings and resources that we offer on our website. There's also a NIMAS file feedback button we've incorporated into our website in the last few years that gives folks the chance to report when a file doesn't convert correctly in their software or they notice some other issue with it. So folks reported that as well. Um, so lots of good information that we got from there. And then finally, just to point out, we asked if NIMAS files help to facilitate timely delivery. And we were so happy to see that 94% of folks strongly agree with that sentiment, that NIMAS files are really essential in helping to facilitate timely delivery. So your work in preparing these files and submitting them to the NIMAC is really essential. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nicole.
Great, thanks, Liz. So what we're going to start out with now is talking a little bit about the NIMAS file set and some of the key resources for preparing your NIMAS files. And so when it comes to creating a really high quality file, there are basically three key resources. The first is the NIMAS 1.1 specification itself. The second is the DAISY Structure Guidelines document, and the third is the NIMAC Metadata Guidelines document. So all three of these are important. As Liz mentioned earlier, we're going to take a deeper dive in another webinar about the metadata guidelines. But starting out to talk about the technical specification, I want to just talk a little bit about the various components of the file set and kind of where the specification itself comes from. So basically, NIMAS is a subset of DAISY, and if you're really techie, that's Z3986. And the various components include an XML file, one XML file that contains the text from the book, an OPF that provides the required metadata and the file set manifest, a PDF that includes only the title page or covers and the copyright page. And then in addition, all images from the original book are supplied in the NIMAS file as separate image files, and there are several image file formats that can be accepted for that content. So for the XML, basically the technical specification provides the baseline element set that is required for tagging the textbook content. When it comes to what is included in that element set, it includes document level tags, some structure hierarchy tags, table tags, image tags, and then also block and inline elements. So on this next slide, we actually have a list of the block elements and the inline elements. And basically, just, if you kind of skim through these, hopefully all of these look fairly familiar to you. What we would say in terms of tagging specific content for the NIMAS file set, if any of these do not look familiar, you may want to review the specification to ensure that you are using the element set fully and accurately when you're doing your tagging. It's also important to be familiar both with the technical specification and the structure guidelines. Liz is going to talk in a little more detail about the structure guidelines and how to use that resource in a little bit. But these both work hand in hand and they're both essential. One of the things that's really important, we discussed in our first webinar, how that automated file validation step is the first step in accepting files into the NIMAC. And it's important to note that automated validation can only go so far, and it cannot detect whether specific content is tagged correctly. So the NIMAC may require resubmission if the file review or if user feedback identifies that there are significant tagging errors in the XML file. Another thing that I like to point out about the NIMAS specification is that while it identifies the required element set, it does not actually explicitly reference attributes that may be required in conjunction with the baseline element set. And so one example of this is that it does identify that page num, or the tag that is used to identify page numbers in the XML, that is a required element. It does not specifically note that the page attribute and the ID attribute are also required. This is found in the DAISY structure guidelines. So again, ensuring that you are referring to both of those resources can help ensure that you are also including any required attributes. In terms of other file set components, what we have are the OPF, the PDF, and the images. So moving on to the OPF file, again, we mentioned this in talking about the upload process in our earlier webinar. The OPF is really important in terms of providing that essential metadata that identifies the file. It's the source of the record that is going to be created in the system. And the three essential pieces to the OPF are that metadata section, a manifest section, which basically is just a list of all the files in the file set. And then there's also a required spine section that just references the XML file in the file set. So again, those metadata requirements are provided in the NIMAC metadata guidelines, and hopefully you can join us for the part 3 of this series to get more information about that. One special note in terms of the manifest portion of the OPF file, if you are providing MathML in the XML file, fallback images are required to be supplied in the file set, and it is important to ensure that those are referenced in the OPF manifest. So the next item in the file set is the PDF, and it's really important, and sometimes it can be a little confusing uh, because sometimes folks are like, "Hey, the PDF, it's great. I really would love to have a PDF of this textbook." We do not receive PDFs for the entire textbook, right? So the PDF is really for file identification purposes, both for the NIMAC and for the end users of the NIMAS file. It's our authoritative source of information about what material is included in that file set, what book is captured in that source file. So what's really important in terms of what is included in the PDF, generally it's going to have all of the information you need in the title page and the copyright page from the original book. However, it's sometimes necessary, depending on how the book is formatted, to include the covers when needed. The most important thing to note is just that wherever the information is found, those pages should be provided. And so when we're thinking about that critical metadata, it includes the complete title. And again, sometimes that's found on a title page. Sometimes it's only found on the cover. ISBNs, sometimes those are found on the copyright page. Sometimes they're found on the back cover. So it just depends on where that information is located. Publisher imprint, and then copyright statement. So those are really kind of the four key elements there um, to be sure that those are appearing on the PDF that is submitted with the file set. I would note that rarely, but occasionally, that you may have digital materials or some other very unusual print material that is distributed and it does not have a title or a copyright page. In those cases, we do have a guidance document for creating a PDF that captures that essential metadata. So you're welcome to refer to that, or just also you're welcome to reach out to us if you have any questions about that particular issue. One note that I want to make is just quickly that occasionally we will get PDFs submitted in the NIMAS file that are very large. And a lot of times these are really beautiful because they're like production quality PDFs. And I just want to emphasize that the PDF that is submitted in the NIMAS file set is not used in the production of any accessible format. So it doesn't have to be production quality files. On the end user side and even on the upload side and on the NIMAC side in terms of, when we download the files to review them, these large PDF files, they add a lot of size to the NIMAS file set, or they can, but they don't really add value for the NIMAC or for the student. And so we would just caution that if you are generating in your process really large PDFs, more than a few megabytes in size, just go ahead and open the PDFs and whatever software you're using to extract or manipulate those to create the PDF for your NIMAS file, just resave them as a smaller file because that's really what's preferable. What's really important is the information and not the beautiful quality of that PDF itself, because again, it's not actually going to be used to create an accessible format. Next, I want to talk about the image files for NIMAS. Again, the technical specification does require that all images present in the source book be supplied as separate image files in the images folder. SVG, PNG, or JPEG formats are accepted, and the actual quality requirement is that the image files must be 300 dpi at their original size and resolution. And this has a really significant practical impact because it's essential for usability in producing large print. We want to ensure that the images that are supplied can be used to generate that accessible format. We also recommend, in terms of usability of the NIMAS file set, that the image file naming convention reference the print textbook page number, where the image appears. This can make it a lot easier. For example, if you are a Braille transcriber and you know you want to produce a tactile graphic for a specific image, it makes it much easier to locate that image in the file set, pull it out, and then create that graphic. In terms of the best practice as well, there is going to be that images folder, and we just recommend, and this is standard. I probably everyone on this call already does this, but using a folder structure to further organize the images by chapter or unit, just to make them easier to work with by the accessible media producer. One other comment about image quality is that it's really important, if you happen to be a publisher, that you are providing a high quality source file, for example, a high quality PDF, to the conversion vendor so that those high quality images can be extracted. Occasionally, we will have issues where a vendor has not been able to provide a high quality set of images because they did not receive a high enough quality source file from the publisher. And so this is just a really important piece to keep in mind. And if you are a vendor, we would caution that if you have received low resolution images, resaving as 300 DPI will not resolve the issue. Generally, resaving files in that way will result in blurry images. And just to note, if the NIMAC does find that images are not crisp, they're not clear, and they are blurry, that even if the properties in for the image shows 300 DPI, we will go back to the vendor and say, these are not going to be usable for all accessible formats, and so we're going to need some better quality images. So if you have any questions about that. And so the last thing that I want to talk about before I kind of send it back over to Liz to take a deeper dive into the DAISY structure guidelines is the issue of images and text. One of the things that's really essential, especially when it comes to automated conversions of NIMAS into an accessible format like DAISY or EPUB, is that text, it's really essential that textual content is included in the XML, because this is the only way that an automated process is going to be able to capture that and make it available to the students. So the general rule of thumb is don't supply text as an image in your NIMAS file. And this would also apply to tables. Sometimes for design reasons, text may be visually captured inside of an image, or a table may be captured as an image, but these should actually be tagged in the body of the XML file. As a side note, it's also not acceptable to supply entire pages as an image file. This is something that, again, because of how some books are originally produced, that might be a really easy way to kind of split them up, but that's not what you want to do for NIMAS. One thing that there are basically, sorry, Liz, can we jump back just real quickly to that prior one? So just before we move on to the examples, basically text that is integral to an image or is something that has standalone value as text. It should be captured either as alt text or, if it's more extensive, in a production note. And we'll have an example of that in a moment. There are some times when the text is incidental, or it's a part of the image. Alt text itself is not required for NIMAS. It's highly recommended, but it's not required. So generally speaking, that's not going to be something that you have to do, but we do have an example of text in an image that would be required to supply in a production note. We do have some guidance about this, but if you have any questions about this, if you have specific images or specific content, please feel free to reach out to us, because sometimes it feels more like an art than a science. But again, the ultimate goal is just the maximum level of accessibility. So in this next slide, we have an example of some text that is provided. It's a part of an image, but in this particular case, this text is not really meaningful without a full description of what this image is. So in this case, it's not going to be particularly valuable just to capture that text, right? So this is a case where we would say, as a matter of NIMAC practice, we would not expect that, okay, you really need to capture this text in the XML. In the next example, however, it's a little bit different. This is a case where, we have several sentences of text. We have some write-in lines, and it's sort of the graphic content is there's sort of a flow to it. There are arrows in it, and so we can kind of see a rationale for why we would want to retain that image to show the relationship between the different components. But because this is essentially, it's basically text that has meaning standalone and is essential to the text. We have an example here. We're not going to go through the tagging of it specifically, but this would just be a case where we would say, this is important text, capture it as a prod note so that it will be available in the XML. So the last thing to talk a little bit about here before I hand it off is that that it is possible. We've kind of talked just kind of quickly through the requirements of the technical specification. We do have options to make higher quality NIMAS, make that available. And two of the possibilities there are to provide MathML for math content, scientific notation, and providing alt text for images, and again, production notes for longer descriptions. Again, generally that alt text and production notes are optional, except in cases where text has been captured in an image and it is important to capture in the XML. It's also possible to use the full DAISY element set in XML tagging. We would advise, if you're considering that, reach out, because there are a few caveats in terms of not all software that converts NIMAS into accessible formats recognizes the full DAISY element set. So in theory, it can seem like a really positive thing, but in practice, there are some kind of pros and cons to that. So you might want to reach out if you are considering doing that. So with that, before I hand it off, are there any questions? I know we've covered a lot in a pretty quick amount of time, but are there any questions about what we've covered regarding the requirements of the technical specification?
Hello, Nicole. And
Hi.
Priti, I have a question regarding the MathML for NIMAS requirements. You mentioned that fallback images are required. Is it then recommended, or is it mandatory to include a fallback image for
At
the
this,
method? Yeah.
yes, that's a really good question. Because of the because MathML is not universally supported, especially particularly in Braille translation software, we do have to require at this time that fallback images be provided if MathML is supplied. Our hope would be that eventually we have this universal adoption and support of MathML, and we would be able to eliminate that requirement. But currently, it is mandated and it is required. So thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hi, Nicole.
Yes.
Hi, Nicole. Ah,
Hi.
hi. Can we use complex mathematical equation for alt text?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that question?
Complex mathematical equation convert as the images using alt text for alternative solution for that.
Sorry, I still didn't.
Complex complex mathematical equation captures images for this case.
So are you talking about using a specific
MathML,
tool to
MathML.
create
Yeah, MathML.
math?
Yeah.
So you're talking about using a specific tool to generate MathML?
No, not the tool. If a complex MathML convert as images for alt text given for that.
So Are you talking about alt text for the MathML?
Yeah, MathML element
Okay,
for the complex.
yes, so we'll talk a little bit later about alt text for MathML. So maybe hold
Okay,
that question until a little bit later.
okay,
Does
thank
that
you.
make okay? Yeah, thank you. So
Great. All right. Well, we'll keep moving. We've got a lot to cover still, but thank you. Those are good questions. So, just going to quickly go over the DAISY structure guidelines. Hopefully, you all have taken a look at them before, consulted them before, but like Nicole said, in addition to using the prescribed tags, it's also required that the tagging of content for NIMAS be done in accordance with the DAISY structure guidelines. Following those guidelines helps to ensure that your files are tagged correctly, and importantly, that they'll be usable in producing accessible formats. That is the entire purpose of working with the DAISY structure guidelines. And I will note that our automated validation process can't evaluate adherence to the structure guidelines. So that is something that we, as a NIMAC staff, evaluate as we are manually reviewing your XML files. The DAISY structure guidelines can be explored in two different ways. You can either work through the major structural elements or you can work through the index of elements. The major structural elements, they're all linked here in this slide, include the levels, the syntax, the divisions and class attributes, as well as alternative level markup, and then the main structures of your book, your front matter, body matter, and end matter. So this is one way to go through the DAISY structure guidelines and look for the particular information that you need. The other way, and I think this is the way that I tend to utilize the structure guidelines more, is to go through the alphabetical index of elements. And that can be used to locate all of the elements and attributes that are included in the DAISY specification. And for each element, the index entry will include a definition of the element, the syntax, as well as examples. So here on this slide, you can see an example of the entry for sidebar. At the top, you'll see the definition or explanation of how you would utilize sidebar, what a sidebar is. And then below that, you'll see the syntax or how that sidebar tag would be used and what can be nested within it. And then finally, below that, there'll be some examples. Typically, there'll be one or two examples, and then there'll also be an illustrated example where you'll see images of a PDF along with tagging. I will say the examples in the structure guidelines aren't always extremely complex. They tend to be a little more simple. So you may encounter something where you're not quite sure how to handle it because it's just a more complex application of a particular tagging. So always feel free to reach out to us if you're not quite sure. As I mentioned, our automated validation process can't detect errors in applying the structure guidelines, but within our manual file review process, if we do detect any errors, we will require correction and resubmission. And we typically, when we do provide that feedback, we will link you directly to the section of the structure guidelines that we're referencing so that you'll be able to see that information and how to tag that section of the material correctly. And with that, let's jump into some best practices for specific tags and specific structures within your instructional material. First, let's talk about lists. Lists are one of our most common structures that we find throughout instructional material, and there's some special types of lists as well that we'll address here. And list tagging, the type attribute is not required for lists that include no numbering or bullets, such as a table of contents or an index. However, for lists that do have bullets or numbering, there are three type attribute options. We have unordered or type UL lists, ordered or type OL, and pre-formatted or type PL lists. The unordered list type should be used when you are tagging a bulleted list. So that this tagging should automatically generate a bulleted list in an accessible format conversion. Ordered list tagging should generate a numbered list in the accessible format, but We do know that this attribute is not well supported in translation software. So for usability, we strongly recommend that vendors use pre-formatted list tagging. And I think over the last year or so, we've had most folks have adopted this as your best practice and are routinely not including ordered list tagging within your files. So we really appreciate that. And I'll show some examples here in a minute. And then finally, pre-formatted lists. In this type of list, no numbering or bullets are automatically supplied when the file is converted. So instead, the numbering or bullets would be provided inside the list item tags. Again, due to limitations specifically in Braille conversion software, this is where we see this issue most commonly. We encourage you to tag your numbered lists as pre-formatted lists. So if you see here on this screen, we have an example of a PL list, and then those numbers 1, 2, 3 are included within the list items themselves. And a side note here, glossaries are a special kind of unordered list, and they have their own tags, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Another hint here is to avoid the use of paragraph tags inside of list item tags. Instead, we recommend that you use the optional list item component tag if you wish to tag two components in a list item. So on the screen here, you can see two examples of how you might tag the same entry. One is to include both items within a single list item tag. And the second example shows how to provide the two items within your list item in separate list item component tags. So both of those examples are acceptable. And a recommendation from the structure guidelines to note is that if you have more complex information, including you have more than two list item components within a list item, you may consider tagging the content as a table instead of a list. Using internal links when tagging an index or table of contents is optional, but these are very helpful when NIMAS is used to generate digital formats like EPUB and HTML and our newest digital format, eBraille. Having those internal links in your file is extremely helpful. Links can be included either with or without list item component tags. So again, on the screen, we have two examples, both acceptable of how to include your A tag with your link within a list item, one using the list item component tags and one not. So either way is completely fine. One note though, if you do choose to use list item component tags, a space should be included between those tags. It isn't automatically supplied by conversion software. So if you don't include that space, those items will just show up right next to each other. Okay, I mentioned glossary tagging. Glossaries are tagged using a special definition list or DL tag in conjunction with the term tag, the DT, and the definition tag, the DD tag. So you can see here on the screen syntax, you would use a single glossary list tag, the DL tag, to enclose the list. Do not use the DL tag to enclose individual glossary entries. It is just to enclose the list or the alphabetic section of the glossary. And then you see the syntax here. You would have, typically you have your term, your DT tags first, followed by your definition, and then so on and so forth. On the screen here, you can see a sample glossary snip. As I mentioned, the DL tag is used here to wrap the alphabetic division letter A section of the glossary here. And then within that glossary section, you'll have your term followed by your definition, term, definition. If you do have two or more components to each list item, again, it might be appropriate to mark up the list as a table. And one of the most common examples we see of this is for multilingual glossaries. So if you do have an English and Spanish glossary at the end of your book, instead of using the the definition list tag, you may want to utilize a table instead. Again, this kind of depends on the layout of the book and how the entries are formatted, but it's up to you. You can certainly tag that content as a table instead. If you run across something and you're just not quite sure how to capture it correctly, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are more than happy to help. Speaking of tables, tables are marked up using the table element in combination with these tags. The caption tag, if it's applicable, the T head tag, which contains the column heading row, the T body tag, which is an optional tag that tags the main body of the table. And then you have your table rows, your TH or cell containing your column heading, and then your TD, which is your cell that contains your table data. Tables should be tagged as text in the XML. Please do not provide tables as images. This does happen from time to time, and we will provide feedback on it when we see it in your file. These should be provided as text. Tables that are found in K-12 instructional materials may be simple or they may be complex. Some tables may not include a caption or a footer, and some may. However, tables will commonly include column headings, and so this content should always be correctly tagged using the T head and TH tags. These tags are particularly important for navigation when NIMAS is used to produce digital formats. So you can see an example here. On the left side, you'll see the original text, and it does include headings for 2 columns. And then on the right, you'll see the appropriate tagging for this table, including usage of the T head and TH tags. So you'll have your T head tag that wraps your 2 headings, your parent company, and your divested business headings, and then below that you'll have your table rows, and then within those rows you'll have your table data that fits under each column. So this is, again, a simple table, a simple example. Switching gears a little bit to talk about pagination. Pagination or page num tags are required for all NIMAS files created for print materials. They are required. The page attribute should also be present on all page num tags. And there are 3 options here. You might have page front. That is for Roman numerals that are found in the front matter. Page normal is for integer only pagination, so your standard integer pagination. And then page special is for any other type of pagination that it includes letters, or even empty tags as well. If the printed book has no pagination, page num tags are still required to indicate where there are physical page breaks. Unnumbered pages that are not within a numbered page sequence are tagged using an empty page num tag with the page attribute of special. So again, those are unnumbered pages that are not within a numbered page sequence. Please don't use page normal with an empty page num tag. You always want to use page special for those empty tags. Unnumbered pages that are within the sequence of numbered pagination are going to be tagged and numbered as if they show a number on the physical page. So even if that number is not there, you're going to include that number in your tagging. Next, write-on lines. So blank lines are extremely common in K through 12 materials, particularly workbooks, but we see a lot of write-on textbooks now as well. And there's unfortunately not an XML element in NIMAS for write-on lines. So the best option, the best practice for capturing those write-on lines is to use underscore characters within span tags to capture those lines. So you'll see here on your screen 2 examples, span with the class attribute WOL or write-on line with those underscore characters, or span with the class attribute blank line with, again, those underscore characters within the span tag. So that is the appropriate way to capture write-on lines. While it is necessary to capture write-in lines in NIMAS, tags should not ordinarily be used to try to reproduce any blank space on a page that is not meaningful. Your NIMAS tagging is semantic. It's not intended to capture the exact physical layout of your printed pages. It's designed to capture the content within those pages. So please don't use paragraph tags to create empty space on a page. If you do need to hard code empty space into a page, instead utilize that line break tag. But we would expect that the use of that tag would be minimal because, again, you're not trying to capture the exact physical layout of your printed pages. Okay, with that, are there any questions before I hand it back over to Nicole to talk a little bit more about alt text and MathML?
Hi, Liz.
Hi.
This is Satya. I have two queries. The first, how to tag for Roman list and alpha list? Can we use pre-formatting type?
Can you use pre-formatted lists for, I'm sorry, what type of list?
Roman list and alpha list. I double
For
I
Roman
triple I.
numerals, yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Please do use please do use pre-formatted lists for Roman numerals. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Second one, uh, to preview the NIMAS XML, have any XSLT style sheet? It will help to preview the images, table formatting like bold, italic, to preview
Mhm.
the stylings.
To have
XSLT style sheet to preview the XML, NIMAS XML. Any particular XSLT we have?
like a style sheet?
Yeah.
No, there's nothing. No, there's nothing like that that I'm aware of. I don't know, Nicole, if you have any thoughts on that, but yeah, and no, you can utilize like the Daisy pipeline to quickly convert what you've produced into EPUB. If you want to see how things quickly convert, that's a pretty easy way. But yeah, there's no style sheet or anything to use with NIMAS.
Okay. Thanks, Liz. Thank
Sure.
you. It helps. We can convert to EPUB package, then we can load into some EPUB readers, correct?
Right, yes. Yeah, the EPUB, yeah, if you convert your NIMAS file to EPUB, yeah, you can use it in any reader. Of
Thank you. Thank you very much.
course.
Hi, Liz. There were certain values that you mentioned, like for example, when the page num is defined, it has to be page equal to special, or for front or normal, and
hmm
any other values like for span class also is are these predefined, or and should be used as is, or is it something that is based on the encoder?
They are, yeah. So the page tagging that specifically, you can find that in the DAISY structure guidelines. It is predefined the usage of those attributes. There isn't that specific formatting for write online specified in the structure guidelines. So we're providing that guidance and the attribute to use. But we have seen people use something other than WOL or blank line there. And it's not an issue. It shouldn't be an issue for the conversion software if you do that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right. With that, I'll hand it back over to Nicole.
Great. Thanks, Liz. So to kind of wrap up this session, we just want to take a few minutes talking a little bit about those best practices that can enhance the quality of the NIMAS files, and then we're going to tidy it up with just a few final pointers for this afternoon or for this morning. It's not, well, it may be afternoon where you are. Um, but it's actually still morning here. So to talk a little bit about the alt text, we talked a little bit about this earlier in the presentation. Alt text is recommended but not required for NIMAS. However, the alt attribute must be present on all of the image tags. That's a requirement of the specification. Generally speaking, we want alt text to be short. It can be a short phrase, but it should generally not be more than 1 or 2 sentences. If you have a more complex image, we would highly recommend that you use a prod note to describe that. We do have an image description resources doc for more information on that. And just as a side note, I would also just point out we will be making this PowerPoint available. So this will be available as a resource if that is helpful for you going forward as well. When it comes to creating the good alt text, we generally recommend that publisher staff write or at a minimum review alt text supplied with NIMAS files. And the reason for this is that it's really important for alt text to be relevant to the text, and sometimes that's most apparent to the publisher. It also needs to be clearly written, grammatically correct, and age appropriate. Uh, we do not do a comprehensive review of alt text when we do the manual file set review for certification, but we will spot check it. And so if there are lots of mistakes, if there are spelling errors, grammatical errors, we will require that it be corrected. Again, alt text is not required, so if it is not good quality, the publisher does have the option to just remove it. But good quality alt text is really valuable, so we do value it if you are able to supply good quality. In terms of where we are right now with MathML, there are, MathML again is that alternative markup for math and scientific notation. And the reason that this is valuable is that, especially for Braille, it does allow that content to automatically be translated. Otherwise, if math is provided as images, we literally still have transcribers who are keying in every math expression from the book if it is included as images. And so we highly recommend that MathML be used. MathML 3 is the current standard. It's actually been the standard since 2010, so we really highly recommend that you use that. Files will not be rejected for including MathML 2. But we recommend MathML 3. We do have a short document related to the MathML, submitting MathML, and we're actually working on creating some additional resources. I did I followed up directly with Suresh about his question related to alt text in MathML, and the question that he had was, if you have really complex math, is it okay to include that as an image with alt text? And basically, in terms of this specification, it's always fine to include math. Technically, it's okay to include it as an image, and if you do that, including the alt text is really valuable. But I will say that if you have questions about, how do I tag this particular expression? Find it challenging. One of the things that is on our technical assistance radar is developing some additional resources around MathML. We've become really aware that there just isn't a lot out there beyond the MathML specifications themselves. And so we would be happy to hear from you if you have a particular question, because we're kind of strategizing now about how can we provide better support for creating MathML. So we would love to hear from you. Another thing I'll just point out is that the MathML 4 specification is in draft. It was posted last month, and so you are welcome to take a look at that if you're interested. Once that becomes a formal recommendation of the W3C, we will support that as well for NIMAS files. As a quick note, depending on whether you have MathML 3 or MathML 2, your declaration at the top of your XML will look a little different. We have examples of that in that MathML document that is available on our website. And another thing that I just would like to point out quickly is that if you do include MathML in your file, we would ask that you ensure that you capture all of the math. Oh, all of the math uh, as MathML and not as regular text. And fallback images are required. There was a question about this earlier, that fallback images for all MathML expressions are required. And so these should be referenced in the OPF manifest, and they should be 300 DPI. So one of the things that's a little bit curious about MathML is that generally speaking, we highly advise that alt text be provided for images. We do not advise any longer that alt text be provided for MathML. And the reason for this is that text-to-speech support has improved significantly. So if you are including MathML, the likelihood that, if there's software that can use that MathML, then that alt text is not going to be required, and it might actually lead to the student hearing the same content twice, first from the MathML and then second from the alt text. And so, so the alt text attribute should be included on the tag, but we advise that it be empty. Aha. So this is what I was referring to earlier. Sorry, I got a little bit out of order with this, but one of the things that we commonly see is that it can be very easy for simple expressions that can easily be entered using a regular keyboard, that those may be included as regular text in a file that includes MathML. We would just ask that you check and make sure that if you've created a file with MathML, that you've captured even those simple expressions. The practical value of this or importance is that when it comes to Braille translation software, not tagging all of the math, even the simple math, as math, can lead to the wrong Braille code being used to capture that content in the Braille book. So one of the things that we recently did is we actually made an enhancement to the NIMAC validation wizard. So if you actually have this in one of your files, you will now see a warning that says, hey, it looks like you've got some simple math that is tagged as regular text, and it will just give you a heads up about this. It will not prevent the file from being uploaded, but we do recommend that if you see that warning, that you kind of take double check that file and see if there's something content in there that should be tagged as MathML. So 3 really quick final reminders. First, we always want you to transcribe the complete title page in the XML. A lot of software will ignore doc title and doc author, so even though those should be included in the XML, always transcribe the complete title page. The second one is that metadata in the XML in the head tag, that is permitted for full DAISY. This can be a little confusing, but it's not permitted for NIMAS. So leave your head tag empty. And then last but not least, if you are using particularly a Mac computer to zip, make sure that there are no extraneous files. Sometimes that Mac compression can generate these kind of little duplicate folders or duplicate files. Those can hang up the file upload process. So just make sure that those are not in there. And so with that, I just would like to note again, this presentation will be archived. There are additional resources on our website. We encourage you to take a look, and we always just encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions. We do have our next couple of webinars that are coming up, webinar 3 and 4 that Liz already mentioned, and hopefully you can join us for that. And then last thing, something that's really, really important and super valuable for us is if you could just take a couple of quick minutes to complete our exit survey. We actually pay a lot of attention to this feedback. It really helps us in terms of figuring out what works with the trainings, what additional trainings might be helpful. So we really appreciate your feedback with that. And with that, we are at the top of the hour. But if anybody would like to stay for another couple of minutes, we would be happy to stay for a few moments to answer any additional questions. So any questions before we formally wrap up and stop our recording for the day?
And Nicole, I just have one more question regarding MathML.
Sure.
Uh, uh, Although the complex and the block equations are always coded as MathML, you mentioned that the inline equations should also be coded as encoded as MathML. So even if it's just an operator like greater than, uh, as in the within the plain text, so should that be also coded as encoded as MathML, and should we have a fallback image for that greater than symbol?
Actually, I think that the answer from the Braille transcriber standpoint is that if the file includes MathML, and even if it's that yes, you would want to
Okay.
include any type of math with that.
And what about the fallback image? We should be having a fallback image for that.
Yes, we would want to have the fallback image for that as well. So,
Okay,
and
thank
again,
you.
and that's only for a file that is for math content and it has MathML. If you had an English book and somehow, you just had that in there, that may not be something that would be necessarily translated into the math code in a literary context. But for math books, generally speaking, anytime you have the math content, the student would be wanting to read that in the math code. So.
Understand. Thank you.
Mhm. Sure. Thank you for asking.
Okay,
Other questions?
I'll go ahead and stop our recording, but we'll happy to stay on another minute.